Hey everybody, this is chapter 4 of Christos Memos' Open Marxism Critical Theory as Militant Enlightenment. Chapter 4 is titled Dispelling the Statist Myth of Socialism on Party and State Forms. The critical social theory of the open Marxist tradition questions the concept of praxis that generates the specific historical, social, economic, and political forms of capitalist relations, as well as the political forms of the working class organization. Political forms, such as the capitalist or Stalinist state, or the various forms of party organization, are understood as forms of specific social relations, and therefore they are conceptualized and criticized historically. The most critical and subversive open Marxist trends are opposed to the mythology that has been reproduced and perpetuated by the traditional left, and which conceives of the state and party as historically necessary institutions, both through the struggles against capitalism and the creation of a socialist society. Open Marxists refuse to perceive the party and state forms as eternal, natural, and ahistorical political entities which have their own logic and transhistorical properties and act as the real subjects within an assumed and objective framework of social relations and inevitable laws of social development. Instead, they tend to emphasize the specific social and historical constitution of these forms. Political institutions such as the state and the party are seen as forms and epiphenomena of the praxis and product of the activity of living human subjects and the class struggle. That is, the antagonistic relationship between capital and labor. The real-life social process, which underlies these political forms, is thus confronted with these institutions that have been imposed upon it. Instead of emancipating societal and life processes from the compulsion of state and party institutions, institutional Marxism and the traditional left, in both their Leninist, Stalinist, and social democratic variants, have furthered a new, quote, mythology, end quote, and elevated them to absolute forms of political and social organization. A large part of these myths, misconceptions, stereotypical thinking, and semi-religious beliefs involve the identification of socialist politics with statism and party politics. In many instances, the political forms of the bourgeois revolution were endorsed almost unconditionally, and both the state and the party forms were misjudged as the decisive means for social and political struggle and revolutionary transformation. As a result, the content of the politics of the traditional left is gradually transformed into a conformist, opportunistic, and, quote, conceptless praxis that acknowledged no measure other than itself, end quote, Adorno, and which resembled and perpetuated some of the most repulsive aspects of the bourgeois political sphere. The old socialist tenet that political action should strive for the abolition of politics as the domain of professional politicians and technocrats is inverted so that socialist politics came to be seen as the political activity of party managers, manipulators, bureaucrats, and self-appointed representatives. Against the background of this mythology and mystification that conceived of socialism as being synonymous with the state and party politics, open Marxists argued that the concept of socialist politics amounted to the free association, AO, self-activity, and the politicization of mature and educated autonomous social individuals. The traditional left's perception of politics, which separates the sphere of politics as the domain of professional politicians from that of society, be they the Leninist, Stalinist professional revolutionaries of the political elites in the social democratic parties, and the idea of the self-organization of the people are mutually exclusive. Critical reason, as deployed in the largest part of the open Marxist tradition, sharply opposes the technocratic politics of the party experts and the hierarchical, authoritarian, and heteronymous political institutions. In line with De Boer, the open Marxist critical reason, argues against the instrumental rationality and activity of the party professionals and experts, perceiving them as a, quote, concrete inversion of life and as such the autonomous movement of non-life, end quote, De Boer. Although there have been certain voices within open Marxism that have espoused and endorsed Lukács's view that the working class struggle against capitalism must be organized in the form of a political party, and by and large, open Marxists view the form of the party as a specifically and typically bourgeois type of political organization. The party as a political institution is a, quote, hierarchical political organization with very little equality and genuine participation, and the party tends to create and preserve an artificial unity of will and faith in an apparently just cause by ideological manipulation and compulsory discipline, end quote. Markovich. This critique of the party form as a means of bourgeois political organization tallies with what Kozik perceived as the imperative need for the politics of the left to, quote, nurture within itself a critical spirit and unprejudiced clear-sightedness in order not to succumb to the left's own myths and ideologies, end quote. Kozik. Open Marxism's struggle against the myths and ideologies of left politics and orthodox Marxism cannot be fully understood in abstraction or severed from the historical, political, and theoretical aspects of the socialist tradition, including the manner in which Marxist thought has been used to serve and enhance party politics and statism as authoritarian and oppressive tendencies within the left, broadly conceived, in the course of the unremitting social and political struggles of the radical and anti-capitalist socialist movement, the critical and controversial organizational issues sparked fierce debates within the various Marxist currents, but also between Marxists and anarchists after the split of the First International. Sorry, I pressed the wrong button. I gotta find my space again. Come on. Given the historical, theoretical, and political trajectory and integration of European social democracy, Lenin and the Bolsheviks managed to set, or rather impose, the organizational model they espoused and considered to be more effective. The mode of the Leninist party, based on the concept of a vanguard party organized through democratic centralism, prevailed within the socialist movement and appeared to be the exemplary and only form of political organization that was appropriate for the working class struggles. Based upon the political achievements of Soviet Marxism, the Leninist Party was presented as the organized vanguard of the working class that led to the victory, the, quote, success, end quote, of the Russian Revolution. For Orthodox Marxists, both critical Marxists and anarchists were simply the defeated, the losers, those who had failed, and therefore they were on the wrong side of history. Their theories and practices of organization had failed. They had proved to be erroneous, and consequently they were discredited and classified as reactionary and having petty bourgeois ideas and attitudes. They were defamed, denigrated, overlooked, and rejected for being just a, quote, infantile disorder, end quote, of the socialist movement. The Leninist conception of the vanguard party and particular elements of Bolshevik theory and practice introduced to socialist politics elitist views of bourgeois origin that distinguished between the rulers and the ruled, the political elite and the masses, the professional revolutionaries and the politically immature and historically backward working class, which needed to be led and guided. Even worse, the Leninist-Stalinist logic naturalized, canonized, and furthered unconditional and blind discipline in leadership and lust for command and hierarchy. The fetishism of specific political forms, such as the party or the state, took on religious and mythical dimensions and exercised an enormous and lasting influence on the content and form of the socialist movement. It turned theological, metaphysical, and irrational traits of feudal and capitalist political significations into a, quote, socialist tradition. Critical consciousness, autonomous and independent thought, free judgment, political maturity, and responsibility were replaced by faith, unquestioned subordination to the official party line, and compliance. This new tradition of subservience became dominant within the party-state mechanisms, and the fetishism that was professed with regard to the political forms of the party and the state paved the way for future authoritarian and repressive practices. It resulted in Stalin's rule and contributed to the creation of the autocratic institutions of the Stalinist regime. Not only Stalin, but Trotsky too conduced this fetishistic faith in the party to the extent that it attained extreme and frantic forms. In Trotsky's speech to the 13th Bolshevik Congress in May 1924, Trotsky stretched the blind and absolute obedience to the Leninist party to the limit. Quote, In the last instance, the party is always right because it is the only historic instrument which the working class possesses for the solution of its fundamental tasks. ... One can be right only with the party and through the party because history has not created any other way for the realization of one's rightness. The English have the saying, quote, "my country right or wrong," end quote. With much greater justification, we can say, quote, "my party right or wrong," end quote, end quote. Trotsky, quoted in Isaac Deutscher, 1959. Trotsky's theological and Jesuit-like statement and Trotsky's perception of the party as an ideological church falsified the history and political forms of social and political struggles. Instead of aiming for a society emancipated from fear, heteronomous, and religious thinking, Trotsky undermined critical thought by blurring the criteria for the distinction between true and false. The party as a form of political organization rather than real human beings and real human beings' lives and struggles turned out to be the major agent, the real subject which had to be treated as having its own logic and life independent of its members. More importantly, and in line with Lenin's position, Trotsky's conformist, metaphysical, and absolutist views that the Leninist party is the, quote, "only historic instrument which the working class possesses for the solution of the working class's fundamental tasks," end quote, and that, quote, "history has not created any other way for the realization of one's rightness," end quote. Trotsky contributed enormously to a belief that, quote, "there is no alternative," end quote, within the left political tradition in terms of the forms of political organization. To paraphrase Marx, this tradition of the compulsion of preordained and binding fetishized forms of the party organization hovered like a false expectation and at times as a nightmare for the practical and theoretical activity of the living. Deriving its support to a certain extent from Engels' later political views, it runs through the whole body of the socialist tradition, including even more critical Marxist currents. Rosa Luxemburg, for instance, vividly expressed an aversion to party conventionalities in her letter to her friend Sonia, sent from prison on the 2nd of May 1917. Quote, "Sometimes, ... it seems to me that I'm not really a human being at all, but like a bird or a beast in human form. I feel so much more at home even in a scrap of garden like the one here and still more in the meadows when the grass is humming with bees than at one of our party congresses. I can say that to you, for you will not promptly suspect me of treason to socialism. You know that I really hope to die at my post in a street fight or in prison," end quote. Luxemburg's freedom and independence of thought, high sensitivity, and revolutionary romanticism were hardly compatible with the stifling atmosphere of the party congresses. Luxemburg could not breathe freely in a climate of cunningness, compromises, and predetermined resolutions. Her personal theoretical and political idiosyncrasy did not chime with the political intrigues and games, or the lust for authority which undoubtedly existed within the cliques and groups of the party. And yet Luxemburg maintained a strong commitment to the party, remaining faithful to her position until the moment of her atrocious murder. Likewise, and despite his personal adventures with the Stalinist regime, Lukács continued to espouse the Leninist logic, arguing that, quote, "organization, that is, the Leninist-Stalinist party, is the, quote, form of mediation between theory and practice," end quote. Lukács. Footnote. Axelos questioned Lukács' use of the category of, quote, mediation, and more specifically his conception of the party, which with its organization and its discipline, with its conscious collective will, appears to be the unifier of theory and praxis. In this way, class politics and the revolutionary and then post-revolutionary organization are identified with the party. The identification of party dictatorship with class dictatorship led Lukács, in his polemic against Rosa Luxemburg on the subject of the Russian Revolution, to cast Kornilov and the councils of Kronstadt, violently crushed by the party, as counter-revolutionary. It's a weird sentence because Kornilov and I don't understand. To cast Kornilov and the councils as counter-revolutionary. Kornilov was counter-revolutionary, the councils were not, so it's a weird statement. Anyway, on this, see also Holloway's critique of Lukács' understanding of the role of the party from 2005. End footnote. The Leninist legacy was handed down even to the work of the members of the early Frankfurt School. To Horkheimer's, quote, appeal for the reestablishment of a socialist party, end quote, Adorno added, quote, with a strictly Leninist manifesto, end quote. In distinction from his earlier views, Horkheimer also argued in favor of the necessity of, quote, revolutionary leadership, end quote. Quote, the inadequacies of revolutionary leadership can indeed be a misfortune, but however incompletely the political struggle against the inhumanity of the present conditions may be led, the fact remains that is the form which the will to a better order can take at this historical juncture, and that is how many millions of the suppressed and tormented all over the world understand it. Any inadequacy of the leadership, therefore, does not negate the fact that the leadership is the head of the struggle. End quote. Horkheimer. Footnote. See Horkheimer, The Authoritarian State. End footnote. Opposed to the orthodox Marxist uncritical and metaphysical approaches that sought to control and channel class struggles into hierarchical and authoritarian party political organizations, open Marxism's critique of the concept of revolutionary organization in the form of the party drew on the historical experience of social struggles for human emancipation, on the most libertarian aspects of Marx's thinking that have been present as an undercurrent in his writings, and on the tradition of anti-Leninist Marxism considered from a council communist perspective. In this regard, Bonefeld's words succinctly encapsulate the open Marxist struggle to emancipate the theory and practice of the revolutionary project from the Leninist legacy by deploying a, quote, conception of communism as social autonomy where nothing exists independently from the social individual, end quote. Bonefeld, quote, the society of the free and equal, can neither be decreed by the revolutionary party, nor can the society of free and equal be realized through the good offices of the state. The society of the free and equal goes forward through the practical critique of capital and capital state. This critique makes itself practical in the self-organization of the dependent masses who anticipate in their struggle against bourgeois society the elements of the new society, end quote. Bonefeld and Tischler, 2002. It is through the critique of capital and the state, as well as of Leninism, Stalinism, and the social democratic experience, that open Marxism reconstructs the idea of communism rather than by positing communism as an abstract, complete, and closed theoretical dogma. In the orthodox Marxist and Leninist traditions, socialism was perceived as statism and equated with the central role the central role that the state had to play not only in the economy but also in controlling all aspects of social and political life. Socialism was associated and identified with the government and the dictatorship of a single party and the personal power of the leaders. Thus, Marx, who never expatiated on the question of party organization and who castigated all the fetishistic forms of social existence, became synonymous with the fetishism of the party and the statist approaches. It is rather hard to believe that it is Marx himself who wrote to Engels on the 11th of February 1851 concerning the party and its members. Quote, I am greatly pleased by the public, authentic isolation in which we two, you and I, now find ourselves. It is wholly in accord with our attitude and our principles. The system of mutual concessions, half measures tolerated for decency's sake, and the obligation to bear one's share of public ridicule in the party, along with all these jackasses, all this is now over, end quote. Marx to Engels, 11th of February, 1851. Engels' reply to Marx reflects a similar attitude, which is equally unexpected and without doubt far removed from views that came to be seen as, quote, common sense, end quote, and a priori premises for many generations of leftists who favored blind obedience and faith to the various parties and sects of the labor movement. Quote, at long last, we again have the opportunity for the first time in ages to show that we need neither popularity nor the support of any party in any country, and that our position is completely independent of such ludicrous trifles, ... Until then, we shall at least have some peace and quiet, a measure of loneliness too, of course, ... How can people like us who shun official appointments like the plague fit into a, quote, party? And what have we, who spit on popularity, who don't know what to make of ourselves if we show signs of growing popular, to do with a, quote, party, i.e. a herd of jackasses who swear by us because they think we're of the same kidney as they? Truly, it is no loss if we are no longer held to be the, quote, right and adequate expression, end quote, of the ignorant curs with whom we have been thrown together over the past few years, end quote. Engels to Marx, 13th of February, 1851. Marx and Engels were, at least in theory, adamantly against any kind of personality cult, official post, or popularity, nor did they ask, as Engels put it, for the support of any specific party. At the same time, isolation, loneliness, peace, and quiet were the antidote for both Marx and Engels to all these micro-political issues generated by the inept functioning of the party mechanisms and to the trivial juxtapositions and conformisms circulated through the party networks. As Rebel noted, Marx was firmly opposed to the use of his name in the party program of the newly founded English socialists. In Marx's letter to Heinemann on the 2nd of July, 1881, Marx wrote, quote, "In party programs, care must be taken to avoid everything that might show a direct dependence on any particular author or any particular book," end quote. Marx, cited in Rebel, 1981. In the course of the spontaneous and independent social struggles for human emancipation, there must be no ideology, no single author or leader who posit themselves in advance as the hegemonic and official truth. Conceptualizing dialectically this relationship, Benjamin perceptively noted that, quote, "If it is the misfortune of the workers' rebellions of old that no theory of revolution directs their course, it is also this absence of theory that, from another perspective, makes possible their spontaneous energy and the enthusiasm with which they set about establishing a new society," end quote. Benjamin. For open Marxism, the idea of revolution is neither a party affair nor a question of professional politicians, political personalities or charismatic leadership. The party form cannot be posited as an end in itself because, as historical experience has indicated, when it becomes a fetish, then it turns into an obstacle to the goal of human emancipation. From the Workers' Councils on the Russian Revolution, 1917, to Kronstadt, 1921, from the Spanish Civil War, 1936, to Hungary, 1956, and to the May 1968 movement, Lenin's organizational legacy was there to block the self-activity of the people, to emasculate the radical practice in the name of, quote, orthodoxy, and its sterilized ideological and political discourse. According to Rebel, Marx did not found any party, school, or movement, nor did Marx provide a recipe for political action, in distinction to Leninism, which considered the party as the major historical agent. Marx, quote, put all his confidence in the creative spontaneity of those who produce society's wealth without themselves sharing in it, end quote. Rebel, 1981d. Marx was adamant that the emancipation of the working class could only be realized through a process of self-emancipation. Marx and Engels envisaged the radical transformation of capitalist social relations through the revolutionary, practical, critical activity of the, quote, proletarian movement, end quote, in the deployment of which the, quote, organization of the proletarians into a class, and consequently into a political party, end quote, takes place. It is this proletarian movement that develops through its struggle against capital and the state, which they consider to be the, quote, self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority in the interest of the immense majority, end quote. Marx and Engels. As such, the creation of this radical movement would rely, quote, solely and exclusively upon the intellectual development of the working class, as it necessarily had to ensue from united action and discussion, end quote. Independent united action, political education, maturity, and intellectual growth are the fundamental premises for the movement's further quantitative and qualitative improvement. The prerequisites of these premises are freedom of expression and independent critical thinking, which are necessary at moments of danger, social regression, and barbarism. This independent living movement of the people becomes aware of its own essence in the process of the class struggle. Against this background, then, the various forms of working class organization make sense only to the extent that they constitute the product of the conscious and creative spontaneity of the independent and autonomous movement of the suppressed and exploited people. The real conflict which has always existed at the heart of the working class movement is not, according to Rubel, the conflict between Marxism, reformism, or anarchism. The cardinal issue concerns the, quote, antagonism between Jacobinism and self-emancipation, end quote, which runs through the history of social and political struggles and could be succinctly encapsulated in the ensuing vital question, quote, can social classes retain their autonomy of action and consciousness while relying on representative bodies that have been chosen to express and to defend their collective interests, end quote. Rubel. Echoing Rubel's views, Gorin went on to elaborate on and elicit the implication of this approach by noting that Lenin merged elements of both Jacobinism and Marxism in order to invent the, quote, concept of the dictatorship of one party, substituting itself for the working class and acting in its name, end quote. Gorin. So let me copy this down. Both the theoretical and practical political premises of the, quote, avant-garde and, quote, party were reminiscent of the practices of the bourgeois political parties, even if at times they emerged as a caricature of the latter. Practical critical activity, independent thought, and free judgment were replaced by loyalty, unconditional commitment, and self-sacrifice, and the militants were seen as objects that grouped themselves mechanically in the fragmented left movement and its political formations. Leninism has been responsible for perverting and undermining the actual meaning of socialism and building political organizations based on centralized, hierarchical, and authoritarian Leninist lines. Mass spontaneity, direct democracy, and the idea of the self-government of the people were gradually replaced by the concept of the revolutionary, quote, dictatorship, end quote, of the single party, thus reforming an apparatus, reforming an apparatus for the oppression of the people. Horkheimer's remarks concerning the very complex issue of the responsibility of the politics of the traditional left concerning the rise of fascism touch on themes of great importance and certainly contain elements of truth in relation to the profound problems, limitations, contradictions, and failure of both Leninist and social democratic parties. Quote, the adaptation of individuals to fascism, expresses a certain rationality. After their betrayal by their own bureaucracy since 1914, after the development of the parties into world-spanning machineries for the destruction of spontaneity, after the murder of revolutionaries, the neutrality of workers with respect to the totalitarian order is no sign of idiocy. End quote, Horkheimer. The obliteration of all economic, social, and political forms of self-organization and the direct participation and spontaneity of the working class militants, among others, resulted in the peculiar depoliticization of the members of the leftist parties and trade unions. The members of the left and Marxist groups were treated as membership figures or numbers of votes and were subordinated to bourgeois-type hierarchical relations and reasoning, according to which only the party cadres or the party intellectuals with bourgeois origins knew the truth of, quote, scientific socialism, end quote. The dogma had to be imported into the movement by those with such knowledge as Kautsky, quote, the official guardian of the temple of Marxism, end quote, as Luxemburg called him with some irony, or by the, quote, wise heads at the helm of the Russian Revolution, end quote, such as Lenin and Trotsky. That quote's also from Luxemburg. Akin to the capitalist perception of politics, the Leninist-Stalinist organizational political model was based on the premise that specialists of the Leninist Party, the party managers and the professional revolutionaries and state officials were the knowers, who knew the, quote, correct line and the scientific principles of socialism and therefore were responsible for educating and leading the politically immature working class. This kind of politics perpetuated in the working class movement the division between the rulers and the ruled, the vanguard leadership, the political elite of the manipulators and the manipulated, thus establishing a system of, quote, universal manipulativeness, end quote, and, quote, unlimited bureaucratic power, end quote, Kozik. The idea of socialist politics was reduced to merely a technical issue and a matter of bureaucratic manipulation. The self-emancipation of the working class as part of the idea of human emancipation disappeared. In contradistinction to Marx, who pointed out in his controversy with Bakunin that in his critique of utopian socialists he employed the term, quote, scientific socialism, merely in an attempt to denote that he meant confined and understood, quote, science, end quote, as the, quote, knowledge of the social movement made by the people itself, end quote. Marx. In the Leninist conception of politics, socialism was grasped as science, which is superior to that of the bourgeoisie. According to this logic, bourgeois intellectuals or party cadres undertook the task of safeguarding and interpreting Marx's texts and the tenets of, quote, scientific socialism, end quote. Political education, the, quote, scientific theory, end quote, of historical materialism, knowledge of the historical laws and the right, quote, communist consciousness, end quote, emanated from the party elite and individual leaders who deemed the proletariat to be historically and politically backward and immature. The party leadership conceived of its own role as the organized vanguard of the working class, which is responsible for leading the backward workers to freedom and emancipation. From the Leninist viewpoint, the working class, quote, exists within capital as a mere thing, a mere human resource. It exists merely as a component of capital, as variable capital, end quote. And therefore, as Bonaparte argued, the Leninist party sees the working class, quote, in the same way as capital, a nobody, a resource who deserves to be regulated more effectively, end quote. Bonaparte. This lack of confidence in the creative spontaneity of working-class people, the devaluation of their capacity for self-organization and self-emancipation, and the emphasis placed on the role of the professional revolutionaries and party leaders exemplifies one of the paradoxes of orthodox Marxism. On the one hand, it postulates a deterministic economistic schema of history based on the existence, function, and, quote, iron necessity of, quote, natural laws. On the other hand, it maximizes the role of the party to lead individuals, and as a result, quote, starting as conscious creators of history, as, quote, as Stoyanovich pointed out, quote, members of that movement have often gone on to become adherents, followers, and supporters of charismatic leaders, and in some cases simply of dictators, end quote. Stoyanovich. As historical experiences indicated, and Pannekoek vehemently remarked, quote, leaders cannot make revolutions. Labor leaders abhor a proletarian revolution, end quote. Pannekoek. This transformation that led the members of the left parties to become followers, believers, and perfect clapping party devotees amounted to a complete perversion of the idea of socialism as the association of free and equal associated social citizens and producers. It reflected a complete transformation of left and socialist politics, which equated socialism with top-down bureaucratic manipulation, statism, and centralism based on rigid hierarchy, command, and force, namely all the traits which were reminiscent of the political and economic practices of bourgeois political parties and capitalist society as a whole. In this regard, as Bonaparte in 2004 noted, quote, leadership is thus not only a question of the conquest of power, is the presupposition of Leninism in its entirety, end quote. And this authoritarian, hierarchical, bureaucratic, and technocratic notion of politics, quote, mirrors the idea of the business leader of laissez-faire capitalism, adopts it as the organizational means of revolution, and transposes it to so-called workers state. To a so-called worker state, I think it's supposed to say. End quote. Against this background, the Leninist-Stalinist parties behaved and acted as the, quote, owners of the proletariat, end quote, de Boer. And this mindset and organizational structure resulted in the party leadership becoming the ultimate arbiter of both the theoretical production and political practice. On this basis, at the core of the Leninist model of political organization lay the assumption that the emancipation of the exploited masses and the revolutionary spirit of the working class movement could be guaranteed, quote, not in its actual economic and social class content, but expressly only in the leadership of this struggle by way of the revolutionary party guided by a correct Marxist theory, end quote. Korsch. This kind of perception about socialist politics as mass manipulation implied a further and peculiar depoliticization of the rank-and-file militants of the left parties and led to a decline of the, quote, individual capacity for an interest in differentiating good from evil, truth from untruth, end quote. Kozik. Concurrently, their practical political activity ended up in narrowing and stifling practicism, which served as a substitute for critical thinking, theoretical comprehension, and subversive praxis. The blurring of the difference between, quote, reified, quote, fetishized practice and, quote, revolutionary praxis, end quote, Kozik, resulted in a situation in which capital and the capitalist state feared the opposing left parties, quote, only as competitors, end quote, who would, quote, replace the existing rulers, end quote. Horkheimer. This political transformation was primarily concerned with the integration of social democracy, which was, quote, institutionalized in the duplication of the political forms of the liberal state within the Social Democratic Party, end quote, and was articulated on three levels. First, it appeared when the, quote, separation of the state from civil society was reproduced within the Social Democratic Party and the separation of its trade unions from its political wings, end quote. Second, the integration into the mechanisms of the capitalist state occurred when, quote, the formal character of bourgeois democracy was reproduced in the formalism of internal party democracy, end quote. And finally, it took its complete form when the, quote, alienated form of capitalist state power was reproduced in the subordination of the party to the party's political leadership, end quote. Clark. In their critical confrontation with bourgeois-type political reasoning and hierarchy of the organizational forms of resistance of the traditional left, open Marxists posed the question pertaining to the means-end relationship, and in line with Luxemburg, they focused on the, quote, dialectics between movement and organization, end quote, critically reflecting on the dialectical relationship between, quote, experience and the proletarian public sphere, end quote. Bonafelt. In Luxemburg's critique against the, quote, pitiless centralism, end quote, of Lenin's political thought, Luxemburg dealt with the issues of organization, movement, and the historical experience of social and political struggles. In Luxemburg's account, the party is assumed to be neither as a given nor as an eternal form of political organization, but it is understood as being both theoretically and practically in fluid and constant movement, always in the process of being changed by human activity and the experience of the social struggles of the working class. Party ideas, theoretical elaborations, and programs are not fixed in advance or outside class struggle. They claim no infallibility, but prove and form themselves in the process of practical activity of struggle. According to Luxemburg, this entails the, quote, following dialectical contradiction, end quote. Quote, the activity of the party organization, the growth of the proletarians, and, quote, awareness of the objectives of the struggle and the struggle itself are not different things separated chronologically and mechanically. They're only different aspects of the same process, end quote. Luxemburg. Contrary to the endeavors made by both Stalinism and social democracy to denigrate and in essence distort the meaning of what has been labeled as the theory of revolutionary spontaneity, also known as, quote, spontaneism, end quote, Bonafelt argued that there is, quote, no theory of spontaneity to be found in Luxemburg, end quote. What Luxemburg meant by spontaneity was that the, quote, working class God damn it. Where the hell am I? Sorry. Pressed the wrong button. Bonafide argued that there is, quote, no theory of spontaneity to be found in Luxemburg, and, quote, what Luxemburg meant by spontaneity was that, quote, the working class creates in and through the working class' own struggle organizational forms of resistance, end quote, and these forms of organization embody and substantiate the experience of class struggle, because, quote, struggle and the accumulation of experience belong together, end quote. Bonafide. According to Pannekoek, the new forms of political organization, quote, cannot be invention of theory, but have to be built up spontaneously by the working class itself, guided by the working class's immediate necessities, end quote. Pannekoek. In other words, they can only originate in the, quote, practical fight of the workers themselves, end quote. Pannekoek. Sorry, freaking having computer problems. All right. Sorry about that. In Luxemburg's view, there is no strict division between organization and movement or party and class. It's not a case of leaders in the party's central committee on one side and merely executive organs who follow blindly on the other side. According to Luxemburg, the party, that is social democracy, seems to get diffused in the autonomous self-organization of the working class. As Luxemburg put it, quote, the social democracy is not joined to the organization of the proletariat. Social democracy is itself the proletariat, end quote. Luxemburg. It is not the movement that is reliant upon the vanguard party, but quite the reverse. It is the party which, quote, reckons in all its phases and through its entire course on the organization and the direct independent actions of the masses, end quote. Luxemburg. Following Luxemburg, open Marxists shifted the political focus of their critical theory of the forms of political organization from the avant-garde Leninist party to the historical experience of class struggles and the political forms of organization discovered by the movement itself and the autonomous and independent activity of the working class. It is quite in order to claim that for open Marxism in a manner akin to Labriola, critical theory, critical Marxism, or, quote, critical communism, end quote, as Labriola put it, quote, is not a seminary in which superior officers of the proletarian revolution are trained, end quote. Rather, it represents the, quote, consciousness of its difficulties, end quote. Cited in Jacobi, 2002. I'm not sure what, there's like two Labriolas, right? There's Antonio Labriola and Arturo Labriola. I don't know which one's being referenced to. At least I'm pretty sure there's two different Labriolas. Maybe I'm making that up. Anyway, a critical examination of the theoretical and practical experiences of the socialist movement indicates that left politics, as a vocation turned revolutionary praxis into the reified activity of party managers and tacticians, revolutionaries into followers and anonymous masses, and led to integration in the capitalist institutions or worse, to repression and despotism. The historical experiences of the last 150 years of social struggles have evidenced that, instead of dissolving in the end into the democracy of the councils, Horkheimer, parties and professional revolutionaries maintain themselves as a privileged group in leadership with unlimited personal power. Critical thinking and solidarity were replaced by obedience, and so-called socialist politics were alienated from their anti-authoritarian, anti-capitalist goals and the project of human emancipation. Pannekoek's perceptive comment that, quote, the very expression, quote, revolutionary party, and, quote, is a contradiction in terms, and, quote, neatly sums up the critique of the Leninist, Stalinist, and Social Democratic Party tradition. It is a contradiction in terms, since revolution is not a party affair but the product of, quote, autonomous class organization, end quote. And in this sense, revolution, quote, could only be a long process of developing the class organization of the proletariat, end quote. Holloway. For open Marxists, revolution is not understood as an apocalyptic event. Revolution is rather perceived as the conscious process of the theoretical and political self-education and self-organization of the people. The confidence placed in the self-organization, self-emancipation, and creativity of the working class is at odds with sectarianism, the views about the rule of the single party, and the, quote, Lenin-style narrow-mindedness of theoretical views, end quote. Luxemburg, according to which the working class can only be represented by a single party. In this sense, Leninist-Stalinist politics, which aimed at the authoritarian rule of the single party, stood in stark contrast to what Marx considered to be the final aim of the class struggle, that is, the abolition of classes and their antagonism and the institution of an association where, quote, there will be no more political power properly so called, since political power is precisely the official expression of antagonism in civil society, end quote. Marx. For Marx, as Rebel reminded us, for Marx, as Rebel reminded us, it was, quote, not the parties but the classes. It was not the quote, not the parties but the classes, end quote, that constituted the pivotal factor of historical and social change. With the preponderance of Leninist and social democratic politics within the socialist movement, a theoretical and political distortion occurred. The party as a form of political organization was fetishized as a transhistorical means of social change, and the workers' councils as a means of self-organization of working-class politics were deprived of their social and political power. The principle of ultra-centralism expressed in the idea of professional revolutionaries and party technocrats as leaders of the masses and avant-garde advisors and catalysts of political developments came to prevail. In Marx's opinion, the party organizational forms should not be assumed as given or eternal structures and forms of political organization, but should be considered as, quote, ephemeral formations, as, quote, simply an episode, end quote, in the history of the radical movement. They are transitory forms of organization in the process of being changed by human activity. Footnote, for Marx's account of the party as a, quote, ephemeral and, quote, simply an episode in the history of the working class movement, which is, quote, is everywhere springing up naturally out of the soil of modern society, end quote. See his letter to Freiligrath, 29th of February, 1860. End footnote. Nonetheless, from being a historical and ephemeral episode, a transient political form of historically specific social relations and conditions, and one of the means that could potentially contribute to the radical transformation of capitalist relations, the party served as a substitute for class politics. It had been transformed into an eternal political form and rigidified, had elevated itself into an end in itself, and had monopolized the political sphere. Instead of introducing what Marx called, quote, elements of culture, end quote, within the working class struggle for human emancipation, and thus politicizing people and extending democracy to the whole of society, party politics became an obstacle to its expressed own goal, and as a result it oppressed, manipulated, disoriented, and depoliticized the workers. by abandoning the goal of human emancipation, the abolition of any class system. The purportedly revolutionary politics were built on, quote, authoritarian Leninist lines, end quote. And by and large, the left politics remain, quote, divided, sectarian, ossified, and narrow-minded, end quote. Gorin. In distinction to Leninist sectarianism and the idea of the rule of the single party as the only representative of the working class, in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels asserted that, quote, the communists do not form a separate party opposed to the other working class parties. The communists have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. The communists do not set up any sectarian principles of their own by which to shape and mold the proletarian movement, end quote. Marx and Engels. Throughout the anti-capitalist struggles of the last century, the opposite was the case regarding the vast majority of the Leninist groups. Leninist and left parties, and primarily their leading cadres, succeeded in setting up their own narrow sectarian doctrines and by extension separating or distinguishing themselves from any autonomous social initiative and movement. This narrowness actively reproduced theoretical and political disclosure, intolerance, competition, and fragmentation, thus reinforcing the divisions within the anti-capitalist struggles and hence their subjection to capital. By viewing the class struggle as a struggle between parties and groups and by fighting each other, they perpetually reproduced their own enslavement and entrapment. Their, quote, imprisonment was its own handiwork, end quote, Adorno. Even worse, in most cases, their personal differences and conflicts dominated class issues, personal and narcissist issues prevailed over political issues, and private and micro-political problems replaced anti-capitalist struggles, thus depoliticizing, demobilizing, and demoralizing the working class. Marx, who emphatically pointed out that he was not a Marxist, knew very well how to distinguish between a radical movement and the, quote, infantile disorder, end quote, of sectarianism, as Marx put it in his letter to Schweitzer from the 13th of October, 1868, quote, you yourself know the difference between a sect movement and a class movement from personal experience. The sect seeks its raison d'etre and the sect's point d'honneur, not in what it has in common with the class movement, but in the particular shibboleth distinguishing it from that movement, end quote. Marx. 3 years later, in Marx's letter to Bolta, on the 23rd of November, 1871, Marx discussed this issue in the same vein, quote, the development of socialist sectarianism and that of the real labor movement always stand in indirect proportion to each other, end quote. Marx and Engels. For Marx, the existence of all these radical sects was inseparably interrelated with the political immaturity of the working class and its inability to come into being as a self-conscious and autonomous movement of the vast majority of the working class. A similar point was made by Pannekoek. Quote, the working class is not weak because the working class is split up. It is split up because it is weak, end quote. Pannekoek, 1936. Against this background, in a critical dialogue with the Council Communist tradition, open Marxists critically rejected not only the Leninist concept of the party, but also the, quote, party itself as a form of organization, and, quote, stressing the fact that, quote, party and organization are far from being synonymous, end quote. Holloway. For open Marxists, the organizational means of struggle must anticipate the end of human emancipation, that is, communism as a class society. As Bonaparte vehemently put it, quote, the idea of the revolutionary party as the organizational form of revolution has to be abandoned. The form of the party contradicts the content of revolution, and that is human emancipation, end quote. Bonaparte. By posing the question regarding the means-ends relationship, open Marxists argue that the formation of, quote, the liberating and revolutionary alternative, end quote, Kozik, is premised on the idea that the, quote, mistrust of any masters, old and new, creates a solid basis for genuine politics, end quote, Kozik. The rejection of the, quote, cold hand of tradition, end quote, Holloway, however, does not mean that the social and political struggles against capital, capitalist relations, and institutions must be deployed without organization. Quote, negativity as pure negativity is only an abstraction, and therefore at bottom a piece of speculative mystification, end quote. Castoriadis. For open Marxism, the crux of the organization question lies, first, in Agnoli's statement that the, quote, no to capitalist society must be a, quote, organized no, end quote. Quote, das organisierte Nein, end quote, as Agnoli put it. And second, that a free and open social society must already anticipate the organizational forms discovered, adopted, and deployed in an emancipatory movement. The transcendence of capitalist social relations can only be achieved through the organized negation of capital and the state. The deployment of collective self-activity and self-organization is substantiated in the organizational forms of negativity that emerge in the process of social transformation. The new modalities of the organized negation must draw on the experience of the open assemblies, councils, and communes as the organizational means and lost treasure of past emancipatory political struggles. Historically, councils and communes as predominantly anti-institutional institutions, quote, emerged not from self-proclaimed political parties created by and for intellectuals, and quote, as Radis has aptly observed, quote, but from ordinary people in their factories, farms, offices, and communities, end quote. Hugo Radis. In contradistinction to reified, sclerotic, bureaucratic, oligarchic, and hierarchical traditional left forms of political organization, open assemblies and councils indicated, quote, something of the freedom and the spontaneity which will mark the future, end quote. Horkheimer. In and through the practical activity of the, quote, ordinary people, end quote, councils, both in their form and content, combine elements of self-discipline and freedom, which firmly contradict the features of loyalty, compulsion to unanimity, discipline, blind obedience, and submission that characterize the party organizational forms that derive their rationale from capitalist and theological perceptions. Councils, open assemblies, and communes, then, are the organizational means of self-determination in which, quote, the proletarian movement becomes the proletarian movement's own product, end quote. And, quote, this product is the producer himself, end quote. De Boer. The councils, as a means of self-organization, constitute part of a collective undertaking to turn the inverted world of professional politicians and party managers into the real world of working-class self-activity, self-determination, and thus class politics and autonomy. This negative form of organization amounts to an ongoing method of political education and a long process of continuous, critical, practical activity of becoming autonomous, both individually and socially, in the course of political and social struggles for human emancipation. Councils for Open Marxism entail the form of autonomous class organization and struggle that seeks not the seizure of power, but the abolition of power in the capitalist class system. As a means of self-organization, it is part of the self-conscious process of political maturity of those who live from their labor and the sale of their labor power, and their resolution that they, quote, can no longer combat alienation by means of alienated forms of struggle. That they, quote, can no longer combat alienation by means of alienated forms of struggle, end quote. De Boer. The open Marxist critique of party politics shows that this mode of reified and petrified forms of political objectivity is the product of historically and specifically organized social relations. It represents a politically constituted form of capitalist social relations, a world of estranged and objectified political forms of human social practice. However, as Castoriadis noted, quote, one cannot overcome bureaucratic organization by refusing all organization, nor the sclerosis of dead dogmas by condemning true theoretical reflection, end quote. The open Marxist espousal of the councilist organization exemplifies the means of transcendence of the bureaucratic, hierarchical, and authoritarian political organizations, and simultaneously signifies the alternative to the peculiar but utterly disastrous and doomed Leninist Tina. There is no alternative. That is, the idea that there is no alternative to the Leninist idea of the vanguard party. By reifying the resistance to reification, the Leninist form of, quote, avant-garde party has been, quote, reminiscent of the practices of bourgeois political parties, end quote. Rebel, thus transforming politics into technique and bureaucratic manipulation and converting itself into a mechanism that renewed oppression and bourgeois instrumentalism. Traditional left politics perpetually produce the kind of political forms that capitalist society in fact needs. On the other hand, the councilist organization, together with broad political and theoretical discussions, and the idea of councils as organized spontaneity, could exemplify the antidote to the Leninist party machine, but only on the condition that councils are not established from above by government and state decree, but stem from the grassroots people's movement and are the outcome of direct democracy and of the constant struggle to not, quote, degenerate and become merely formal institutions, end quote. Kozik. The, quote, metaphysics of the party, end quote, rebel, put into practice by Lenin and Stalin, with all their differences and backed theoretically by Lukács, fetishized the means in order, among other things, to distract reflection upon the ends and practical implications of the Leninist outlook that replaced the class movement with party politics. It was this conception of politics that saw in the Leninist-type parties and their bureaucratic and authoritarian leadership the embodiment of the preordained dialectics of history. This line of reasoning was akin to the, quote, bourgeois supremacy of means over ends, end quote, Adorno, and was nullified by the historical and political experience of the Stalinist-type system during the 20th century. Historical experience has shown that the professional politicians and the so-called charismatic leaders not only failed to, quote, function as a corrective to bureaucratic authority, end quote, but they also proved, quote, particularly prone to becoming merged with bureaucratic authority, end quote, Adorno. Not unsurprisingly, the historical emergence of the councils and the councilist organizations and the councilist organization has been crushed not only by capital and capital state, but also by the Leninist, Stalinist, and social democratic state power. When they were not eliminated by force and bloodshed, the councils were defamed, denigrated, and disregarded as utopian. However, in an attempt to re-signify and substantiate the meaning of, quote, utopian, drawing on Oscar Necht, Bonafelt noted that, quote, if there was anything in the 20th century akin to a concrete utopia, that was the utopia of the councils, end quote. Bonafelt. Opposed to the utopia of the councils, the tradition of orthodox Marxism for social, class, and political reasons gave primary importance to the political institutions of the party at the expense of the actual life process, and therefore lost, quote, sight of the tension between that which is institutional and that which is living, end quote, and fostered the creation of a, quote, new mythology, end quote. The mythology of the party and the state is, quote, illusory primal qualities, end quote, Adorno. The party, as Holloway remarked, is a, quote, form of disciplining class struggle, of subordinating the myriad forms of class struggle to the overriding aim of gaining control of the state, end quote. Holloway. For open Marxism, the struggle for a free and open socialist society For open Marxism, the struggle for a free and open socialist society is a struggle against the illusory primal qualities, end quote, a struggle against abstractions, be they party, state, or capital. It entailed a process of demythologization and negation of the political forms as, quote, separated power, end quote, which becomes consolidated and present themselves to human beings as something independent of them, although they have emanated from them, in order, as Marx put it, for people themselves to be able to acknowledge and organize their, quote, forces propre as, or forces prop, I don't know how to say that, their, quote, forces prop as social forces, so that social force is no longer separated from them in the form of political force. For people to be able to acknowledge and organize their, quote, forces prop as social forces, so that social force is no longer separated from people in the form of political force, end quote. Marx. Instead of criticizing, negating, and demystifying any political power separated from society, the orthodox Marxist instrumentalist conception of the party was coupled with an instrumentalist conception of the state. This development evolved, as Korsch aptly opined, after orthodox Marxism's, quote, unconditional adherence to the political forms of the bourgeois revolution, end quote, and in particular after the, quote, overestimation of the state as the decisive instrument of social revolution, end quote. Arguably, this conformity, compliance, and integration into the capitalist political forms were twinned with the stifling of self-activity, self-organization, and any movement for autonomy that arose from outside the pre-existing organizational forms. Although they have been the outcome of human social practice, the forms of both the party and the state gradually dominated over and abstracted themselves from the everyday political and social activity of the working class, what had come about as a result of social constitution emerged as crystallized and ossified perverted political forms. This inversion amounted to an extremely disheartening and discouraging process of disempowerment and depoliticization of the people, in which the meaning of socialist politics is emptied of content, political activity as the spontaneous and conscious creation of the people themselves was delegated to state functionaries and party specialists, professionals and technocrats. Quote, even solidarity, the most honorable mode of conduct of socialism, end quote, as Adorno eloquently pointed out, was manipulated and converted into demand for blind confidence in the party, the quote, worker state and its leaders. This perversion not only distracted and hindered the political education and maturity of the working class by concentrating the political into the party and state forms, but also, equally important in terms of its devastating implications, made socialism appear to be synonymous with oligarchic state policies and state-centric principles of economic developmentalism. Although Marx saw in the Paris Commune the discovered and opposite form for the emancipation of workers, the Commune versus the state, and initially, quote, Marxism had developed as one of the most radical anti-statist conceptions, end quote, as Stoyanovich characteristically noted, quote, with suitable modifications it was transformed into a statist ideology, end quote. Stoyanovich. Within the open Marxist tradition, the question of Marx's critique of the state and the relationship between socialism and the state form has been posed afresh. In a manner similar to Stoyanovich, Agnoli argued that despite statements and pompous announcements to the contrary, dogmatic and institutional Marxism entirely reversed Marx's position regarding the idea and role of the state in socialism. In distinction to Marx's critical understanding, this reversal lies in the fact that for orthodox Marxism, the building of socialism was supposed to be the task of the state. This inversion utterly falsified the Marxian critical theory, which, unlike orthodox Marxism, conceived the creation of socialism as a process of dismantling the form of the state. In other words, for Marx, the aim of an alternative socialist society is neither the construction of a, quote, socialist state, end quote, nor the participation in the coercive institutions of the capitalist state, but entails the categorical imperative to overthrow the state. The essence of Marx's critique of politics, according to Agnoli, is that from the very first phases of the socialist transformation of society, and later during the transitional period, the state, which expresses and summarizes the coercive character of social reproduction, begins to wither away and starts a dismantling process. In this respect, one of the most fundamental aspects of the crisis of Marxism is that Marxists lost sight of this critique of the state as the political synthesis of social coercion. Most importantly, the abolition of the state has gradually come to be regarded as utopian, and traditional Marxists have been unable to envisage a socialist social alternative and the continued existence of society without the active economic, social, and political role played by a strong state, that is, by an objective system of coercion. Open Marxists criticized the capitalist state, taking as their starting point Marx's early and neglected radical critique of the state and the critique of the categories and forms of political economy developed by Marx in Capital, and his theoretical premise that, quote, political forms, end quote, cannot be fully understood and conceptualized without reference to the material conditions of life and the anatomy of civil society. Pashukanis' view that, quote, Marx's critique of political economy should be extended to the critique of law and the state, end quote, and that, quote, law and the state should be understood as fetishized forms of social relations in the same way as value, capital, end quote, Pashukanis, was instrumental for the development of the open Marxist critique of the state as a historically specific capitalist political form of social relations. Moreover, the open Marxist critique of the state was developed from the standpoint of the historical experience of statism, as statism emerged in the practical implementation of both the Leninist, Stalinist, and social democratic variants of institutional Marxism. The distorted, alienated, and oppressive forms that attempts to create socialist society assumed in Eastern Europe or China emanated, among other things, from the state-centric doctrines and values that run through the whole body of the orthodox Marxist ideology. According to these statist beliefs and practices, socialism was institutionalized on, quote, principles expressing not the democratic self-organization of the working class, end quote, as Clark pointed out, quote, but the imperatives of the state forcibly imposed on the working class in every area of social life, end quote. Clark. At the heart of these state-centric accounts lies not only the statism of the European social democracy, but also Lenin's infamous definition of socialism, when in an opportunistic and blatant distortion of the idea of socialism in Marxist critical theory, Lenin claimed that, quote, socialism is nothing other than a state capitalist monopoly which is employed for the benefit of the whole people, and thus has ceased to be a capitalist monopoly, end quote. Rebel. Lenin cited in Rebel. It is from this school of thought in politics, the Leninist and social democratic school, and not the critical theory of Marx, that the state-centric doctrines of the traditional left emanated. These statist beliefs and illusions are still very strong within the current so-called left and center-left political parties, which argue that they intend to use the capitalist state and economy for, quote, the many, not the few, end quote. I think that was the tag of the Corbyn campaign. But it's a generic enough phrase, but I think that was specifically used by the Corbyn campaign. In opposition to orthodox Marxism's preponderance as a state doctrine and party ideology, and the misunderstanding of Marxism as an ideology of the state, as Rebel noted, Marx's social critique had two main objectives, quote, money and the state, end quote. From this perspective, Marx neither nurtured any statist mythology nor championed the idea of a, quote, new type of state or a, quote, worker state, end quote, Rebel. For Marx, the destruction and abolition of the state was a fundamental postulate and prerequisite of the struggle for the self-emancipation of the working class and the process of political and intellectual maturation through revolutionary praxis. Rebel added a further dimension to the radical character of Marx's critique of the state when Rebel wrote that Marx's arguments, as they were elaborated in his The Jewish Question and Introduction to a Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, comprise elements of a, quote, anarchist and proletarian manifesto, end quote. Rebel. Axelos also dealt critically with the point and Marx's, quote, negative critique, end quote, of the state, arguing that in his critique, Marx's critical theory is animated by a, quote, communitarian anarchism, end quote. His theses and critical analysis that refer to the, quote, abolition of politics in the state, end quote, are immensely suggestive of the, quote, anarchist accent in Marx's vision, end quote. Following Marx's analysis in The Jewish Question, Markovitch argued that the state, quote, divides citizens into ruling subjects and ruled objects, turns decision-making on issues of general social interest into a specialized professional activity in the hands of an alienated elite, end quote. Markovitch. The state and political bureaucracy are thus understood as forms of alienated institutionalized political power, as estranged forms of social organization whose abolition is an important step in the process of disalienation of politics, and hence is of vital importance for the struggles for human emancipation. The role of both theoretical and practical critique, then, is to demystify these fetishized, authoritarian, and hierarchical political forms and contribute to their dismantling and replacement by self-governing associations of free and equal producers and socialist citizens. Assessing this point through his critical evaluation of the 20th century endeavors for a socialist transformation of social relations that took place in countries such as the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, and Yugoslavia, Markovitch argued that the, quote, bourgeois state was not transcended by a network of self-management organs, but was only modified into a bureaucratic state, which allows a greater, parenthesis, in Yugoslavia, and parenthesis, or lesser, parenthesis, in Russia, and parenthesis, degree of participatory democracy, end quote. Markovitch. The statist myth of socialism and the absurd idea of statist communism prevailed, and people were indoctrinated with them on the, quote, assumption that the construction of communism can be based on an omnipotent state, end quote. Stoyanovich. With the preponderance and expansion of Stalinism, as well as the electoral success of European social democracy during the post-Second World War period, the statist myth solidified and the, quote, emphasis shifted increasingly both in theory and in practice from society to the state, end quote. And concomitantly, quote, Marxism had been perverted into the ideological basis of statism, end quote. Stoyanovich. The development of the economy, technology, and productive forces was identified with the development of socialism, and the authoritarian state was established as, quote, representative of the social character of the process of production over the isolated workers who are only its technical agents, end quote. Clark. This fundamental shift completely changed the focal point of socialist politics, which gradually became synonymous with state property, state management, and state ownership of the means of production. More fundamentally, this equating of the state with society crystallized the dogma that socialism means statism, and statism in both its Stalinist and Leninist and social democratic variants emerged as the only paradigm and inevitable outcome of socialism. Even after the demise of Eastern European Stalinist statism and the tremendous crisis, metamorphosis, and collapse of European social democratic state-centric views and policies, statism has still been presented as a fundamental value of the politics of the left. It continues to be part of the ideology of the left, and the function of the state and the state-centric views of economic development are counterposed as the response of the left and the antidote to the predominance of the markets and the rule of capital and money. The statism of the left has also been continuously evoked by the media and proponents of both neoliberalism and conservatism, with the purpose of caricaturing, deriding, and ridiculing the idea of socialism as obsolete and synonymous with authoritarianism and totalitarianism. The open Marxist tradition The open Marxist tradition counterposed the concept of critique to the preconceptions of both bourgeois and orthodox Marxist ideologies. Critical reflection on the past experience of struggles indicated that the traditional Marxists had failed to destroy one of the, quote, greatest and most influential ideological myths of the 20th century, the statist myth of socialism, end quote. Stoyanovich. Consequently, open Marxism profoundly questioned the statist myth of socialism and argued that with the benefit of hindsight, the lesson to be taken from past experiences by socialists of both the institutional Marxist and social democratic variants is that, quote, socialism cannot be imposed on society through the alienated form of the state, but can only be achieved by building on the self-organization of the working class, end quote. Clark. Contrary to the pronounced beliefs regarding state power and its seizure, what happened in the practical application of both the Leninist and the social democratic policies tallies with what Engels wrote about political development during the Commune, Paris Commune. Quote, and in both cases, the irony of history willed, as is usual when doctrinaires come to the helm, that both did the opposite of what the doctrines of their school prescribed, end quote. This development is related to the fact that institutional Marxism as party and state ideology espoused a bourgeois conception of the state as the institution which manifests and represents the unity of society, thus opposing the Marxian conception of the state as an alienated form of class rule. For quite different reasons, both these approaches assume that the state simply had to free itself from its subordination to the interests of the capitalist class and subsequently become the instrument of the collective rule of the working class. Far from being a merely theoretical failure and distortion of Marx's critical theory, this misconception stemmed from definite social interests and relations and had specific and formidable social and political implications. Traditional and institutional Marxism remained anchored in the capitalist universe and hostage to the capitalist universe's own misleading and distorted analysis of the state, which functioned in the service of certain political exigencies and class interests. Leninism and the orthodox Marxist theory of state monopoly capitalism viewed the state as an instrument of capital and organized political power which is identified with and expresses the interests of the ruling class. The revolutionary task of the communists and the working class was to free the state from the control of the bourgeoisie, seize the state power, and use it as a political device for the transition to socialism. On the other hand, social democracy perceived the state as an institution which has autonomy with regard to the economy and the conflicting class interests. Thus, the quote, political was severed from the quote, economic, and this separation followed the preceding theoretical analysis which separated quote, production from quote, distribution. See Clark. The critique of the state elaborated by the Conference of Socialist Economists, CSE, open Marxist stream, termed the quote, political form approach and quote, discarded the Leninist account of the state for quote, underestimating the independence of the state, end quote. And at the same time, it criticized the social democratic thesis for, quote, underestimating the limits of that independence, end quote. The, quote, political form approach, end quote, conceived the capitalist state as the, quote, political form of definite social relations, end quote. Bonafelt. The objective of the open Marxist account, then, was to criticize the state, and that meant, quote, attacking the apparent autonomy of the state, bracket, understanding, and bracket, the state not as a thing in itself, but as a social form, a form of social relations, end quote. Holloway. Open Marxism did not articulate open Marxism's distinct approach by glorifying the bourgeois institutions and the relative autonomy of the political. It did not grasp the political sphere as a self-enclosed and separate entity, but aimed to criticize and demystify the state form, thus bringing to the fore its social foundations, that is, its social constitution. The open Marxist scholars reopened the debate concerning the Marxist state theory and attempted to articulate, develop, and elaborate their, quote, social form and, quote, method and analysis in order to continue and further expound Marx's incomplete and unfinished project for a critique of politics. Their engagement with the, quote, state debate, end quote, has been a matter of great importance for the formulation of the distinct approach and character of the open Marxist tendency. It also shaped the conception of socialism and the struggles in both East and West Europe for a self-governing and self-managing society, which entailed the, quote, politicization of social relations, end quote, and the, quote, cancellation of the concentration of the political in the form of the state, end quote. Bonafelt. Following the historical development of the Conference of Socialist Economists, open Marxist approach in relation to the Marxist state theory, it derived its line of analysis from the context of the wider academic and political debates within which open Marxists were active. This approach has been deployed in the intellectual, social, economic, and political conditions, in particular milieu in West Germany and Britain, since the late 1960s. Against this background, open Marxist theorists provided a supplemental strand of the critique of the political economy, manifested as a critique of the political and of the state. This critical undertaking of politics was initially embarked on by Johannes Agnoli in 1967 in his influential Die Transformation der Demokratie, the transformation of democracy. Agnoli questioned the merit of the transformation of, quote, parliamentary democracy, end quote, into a representational mode of political power and domination, and supplied us with a profound critique of the form of the capitalist state. With his scholarly work, Agnoli was able to add a critical and subversive dimension to the revolutionary heritage, which included the Marx-Bakunin and Marxism-anarchism controversy. Agnoli agreed with certain anarchist critiques of the Marxian conceptions of the state and its role not only within capitalism, but also in the process of the socialist transformation of the capitalist relations of production. Bakunin's statism and anarchy, and certain of the thoughts expressed in Bakunin's other writings, according to which the objective of the proletariat should have been the, quote, destruction of the state, end quote, and his belief that the only real emancipatory policy was the, quote, exclusively negative policy of demolishing political institutions, political power, government in general, and the state, end quote, provided a powerful point of departure for Agnoli's analysis and critique of the capitalist state and bourgeois politics in general. Agnoli's critique of parliamentarism certainly echoed and further expounded analogous critiques formulated previously in the early writings of Lukács and the work of Rosa Luxemburg. Luxemburg's critical reasoning challenged the traditional left's conservatism, which had repeatedly emerged as an intransigent and conformist adherence to parliamentarism. Luxemburg castigated the tendency of the left to consider, quote, parliamentary tactics as the immutable and specific tactics of socialist activity, end quote. Luxemburg. The left and all the left's variants had attempted to institutionalize and orient anti-capitalist struggles towards their aims and treat the militants of the radical movement as their potential voters in order to reap electoral gains. By doing so, both the Leninists and the social democratic left politics led them to become absorbed in the dominant praxis, thus reproducing the established capitalist power relations and facilitating political careerism and opportunism. Luxemburg countered with the notion that for a revolutionary transformation of capitalist society, the winning of the majority of the people is needed. In other words, she contravened the traditional social democratic conviction, according to which the requirement of a socialist parliamentary majority comes first and radical social change follows. As Luxemburg argued, quote, the true dialectic of revolutions, however, stands this wisdom of parliamentary moles on its head, not through a majority to revolutionary tactics, but through revolutionary tactics to a majority. That is the way the road runs, end quote. Luxemburg. Footnote. Luxemburg perceived the radical transformation of capitalist society as a constant struggle and unending process in which the socialist movement abolishes all the social class relations, advancing through the two poles of the dialectical contradiction. Quote, on the one hand, we have the mass, and on the other, its historic goal, located outside the existing society. On the one hand, we have the day-to-day struggle, on the other, the social revolution, end quote. Luxemburg. The project of revolution ought to move and pass through the dangers of reformism and sectarianism between becoming integrated into the system as a reformist movement and getting marginalized as a trivial sect that represents no real social forces. End footnote. Agnoli's novel undertaking and conceptualization of a critical theory of the state and capitalist political institutions emerged from the intersection of anarchist and Marxist critical traditions. It is this dialectical synthesis that enabled Agnoli to articulate insights about the critique of politics that orthodox Marxists or anarchists themselves could not articulate. In Agnoli's opinion, liberal democracy had been transformed into a, quote, constitutional oligarchy, end quote. And this transmutation presupposed the entire institutionalization and parliamentarianization of the left political opposition, resulting in the political neutralization and integration of social opposition through the pacification of class antagonism. The capitalist state, together with its party system and the principle of parliamentary representation, represents the political form which springs from the capitalist social relations of production. It is not an element of the superstructure that stands above the economic base, but is firmly rooted in capitalist social relations. As such, the state form constitutes the political synthesis of capitalist societies. The state form secures the unity of the bourgeoisie, and because of the individual capital's inability to manage social disputes and conflicts, it controls, formalizes, and pacifies the class struggle. Consequently, the state does not exist in capitalism, nor does it function in service of the individual capitalists. Rather, the state is the state of capital. Therefore, quote, a critique of capital cannot be separated from a critique of the state, unquote. Agnoli and Brun. And if you don't know, Brun was kind of like, I would say, a central theoretical figure. He was like a student, kind of I don't know, I think he's a little bit older, younger than Agnoli. I don't know if you'd call him his like follower or his descendant, but Brun is important in like the formulation of a lot of like anti-Deutsch, pro-Zionism, communism, and the newly reunified Germany in the 1990s. Anyway, the politics of pragmatism and centrism has been the result of the constitutionalization of social and political opposition and has led to the depoliticization of society, among other things. The left-wing parties ended up being partners in the political game of parliamentarianism, which is an oligarchically organized and controlled political competition. With its participation in this channel competitive relationship, left-wing politics has gone through a process of constant assimilation into the capitalist state mechanisms, thus contributing decisively to the maintenance of social and political order, as well as the organization and security of the social reproduction of capitalist society. Thus, instead of being a tool to gain freedom and human emancipation, has been claimed and assumed in theory by the left. The state and the state's parliamentary activities had separated from society and were out of the control of the people. As a result, social conflicts are transformed into predictable and wearisome political opposition in parliament. Social opposition is thus pacified and channeled through the capitalist political institutions, and social struggles are constrained within parliament and the political forms of capitalist social production. The conflict between labor and capital transformed into a conflict between the leaders of the two major parties, who, as time went by, became more and more alike. Despite the alleged differences claimed in their empty rhetoric and technocratic terminology, and their fight for power and government posts, the so-called left and right political parties, quote, form a symbiotic unity in whose sphere an abstract conflict of leadership can be fought out, end quote. Agnoli. The form of the capitalist state, according to Agnoli, can neither serve as a means of achieving individual and social autonomy, nor lead to the emancipatory transformation of capitalist society. As evidenced by the historical and political examples of the social democratic, Euro-communist, and subsequently Leninist parties, the idea of, quote, marching through the institutions, end quote, was a kind of politically necessary illusion of the traditional left. The traditional left parties did not take into account or deliberately ignored the fact that the capitalist state institutions have their own rationale, dynamics, intentions, and goals, and hence state institutions, quote, do not allow themselves to be used in any manner whatsoever, for their logic is not their own, but is determined by the reality whose functioning they serve, end quote. Agnoli. And more specifically, they have, quote, solely the responsibility of organizing and securing the social reproduction of a capitalist society, end quote. Agnoli. Neither the capitalist state nor the political parties are independent, separate, and autonomous from society, because these historically specific political forms are the forms of a specific social content. In the late 1960s, Agnoli's work was politically and theoretically important, as it posed significant political questions while being aware of various unresolved political and theoretical issues, such as the dilemma of whether to participate in or boycott parliamentary elections. The theoretical issues raised by Agnoli with his critique of bourgeois democracy and state institutions have been developed by successive generations of critical scholars. Agnoli's critical theory was fundamental to the development of the, quote, state derivation, end quote, debate in West Germany, the aim of which was to derive the state as, quote, a political form from the nature of the capitalist relations of production as a step towards constructing a materialist theory of the bourgeois state and the bourgeois state's development, end quote. Holloway and Picciotto. I have all the pieces from that book on the channel if you're interested. Agnoli's critique of the political and Agnoli's negation of the constituted power of capitalist social relations, as well as the German, quote, state derivation, end quote, debate, contributed significantly to the development of a materialist theory of the state and the, quote, political form approach, end quote, that took place within the Conference of Socialist Economists, CSE, in Britain. These debates and theoretical elaborations had a lasting influence and played a key role in the formation and intellectual trajectory of the open Marxist tendency that took shape within the Conference of Socialist Economists. The open Marxist critical theory in the UK was developed against the background of the crisis of the Keynesian state and the rise of neoliberalism and the unsuccessful attempt of many left scholars to make sense of Thatcherism by using structural functionalist interpretations. These theoretical undertakings were initially associated with the work of Althusser and Poulantzas, and later on with the writings of Habermas and Offa and the French Regulation School. The heightened economic crisis and the growing social and political struggles served to place the issues of the state and class struggle at the epicenter of the work of the Conference of Socialist Economists. These debates around the critique of the political form of society were formative for the open Marxist group within the CSE, generating a productive and critical dialogue between the contributors, which brought to the fore both the distinctiveness of their approach and their ensuing differences. Holloway and Picciotto facilitated a more in-depth engagement with the German state debate when they edited and published in English some of the major contributions of the, quote, state derivation and, quote, discussion in 1978. The objective was to further advance the critical analysis of the state and give new life to the German debate by using it as a prelude to a fundamental critique of both the orthodox Marxist theory of state monopoly capitalism and the social democratic theory of the state. The latter conceived of the state as an institution which is not only neutral but also autonomous and independent of the economy. In these analyses, the quote political and quote economic were set apart and examined as two discrete spheres of capitalist social relations. Furthermore, Clark published The State Debate in 1991 in an attempt to critically reconstruct, republish, and present some of the contributions of the Conference of Socialist Economists State Debate, including on the one hand papers by Holloway, Picciotto, and Clark, and on the other papers by Barker, Hirsch, and Jessup. Critically drawing on these debates and on the writings of Clark and Holloway, Bonafelt further elaborated and expounded the CSE open Marxist critical theory of the state. Holloway and Picciotto, 1978, argued that Palancis endorsed uncritically the fragmentation of capitalist society into relatively separate and autonomous economic and political structures. Palancis thus failed to make sense of the development of the state form as well as the state form's possibilities and limitations, because Palancis left out of his analysis the relationship between the state and the contradictions of capitalist accumulation. As he was unable to grasp the totality of the capitalist production relations, he failed to develop a, quote, theory of the unity and separation of politics and economics, end quote. Akin to Clark's critique of Althusser, Holloway and Picciotto noted that Palancis identified the, quote, economic with production relations, end quote. And in his writings, he is characterized by a, quote, continual tendency to identify class struggle with the realm of the political, end quote. Instead of examining political forms of the phenomenon of fascism with reference to the capital-labor relation and contradictions of accumulation and exploitation as fundamental forms of class struggle, Palancis and Palancis' followers employed political concepts such as, quote, power block, quote, hegemony, and, quote, governing class, using them like, quote, pigeonholes which can be filled with the relevant contents from a political analysis of the class structure of any given state, end quote. In an attempt to supply an anti-evolutionist and anti-economist theory of the capitalist state, Palancis centered his analysis on the relative autonomy of the political and the state in relation to the economy and the capitalist class, but in his consideration he lost sight of the, quote, fundamental Marxist premise of the capital relation as the principle of the unity, as principle of the unity of the social formation, end quote. Clark. In place of a critical theorizing of why the capitalist social relations emerged in seemingly separate and independent economic and political forms, and why the capitalist state appears to have been dissociated from the dominant bourgeoisie class and separated from society, Palancis attempted, in a manner similar to that of the orthodox Marxists when they examined the, quote, economic, to develop a Marxist political science and study the political as an autonomous and specific object of science. He thus failed to understand that the economic and the political are forms assumed by the historically specific, determined in developing capitalist class conflict relations, and decipher the economic and political categories as forms of the antagonistic relations of exploitation and domination between capital and labor. Footnote: in the same vein, Clark criticized Maurice Daub and Perry Anderson for their failure to, quote, understand the state as a differentiated form of the class relation of production, end quote. Clark. End footnote. According to Clark, Palancis' theory of the state and the limitation of Palancis' analysis emanated from Palancis' bourgeois-like understanding of production relations as technical relations. This conception of capitalist production as a technical process led to the separation of relations of production, determined primarily by the development of technology, from relations of distribution. This perception stemmed from the bourgeois conception of the relationship between the economic and the political, and was, quote, imported into Marxism in the form of a radical separation of economic and political struggle, end quote. Clark. Reformism and social democracy treated the capitalist relations of production as purely technical and eternal. Given that premise, reformism and social democracy conceived of trade union and political activity as an attempt to use state power to modify the relations of distribution. The capitalist production relations are left untouched, unquestioned, and unchallenged, Under the cover of radical rhetoric, more emphasis was placed on the struggles unfolding within the political sectors, within the political structures, and the forms of the capitalist state, which were mostly perceived as being autonomous and external to the capitalist social relations of production. However, the specificity of the capitalist state form derives neither from its apparent autonomy nor its seeming appearance as a neutral and technical organizational and administrative apparatus. Rather, the specificity of the capitalist state stems from its class character. In Clark's words, quote, "The essential feature of the state is the state's class character. The state's autonomy is the surface form of appearance of the state's role in the class struggle," end quote. Clark. Reinforcing this point, Holloway argued that what was of key significance concerning the state debate within the CSE was not just the, quote, emphasis on the political and economic as forms of the capital relation, but also the emphasis on the capital relation as a historically specific form of struggle and domination, a historically specific form of struggle and domination rooted in production, end quote. John Holloway. Holloway maintained the, quote, key to understanding the development of the state is thus the struggles around production, around the changing forms of exploitation of the working class, end quote. John Holloway. Footnote. In his review of Clark's book entitled Keynesianism, Monetarism, and the Crisis of the State, published in 1988, which is on this channel, by the way, Holloway pointed out that in Clark's account, the focus is placed more on the political and economic forms of the capital relation, and the, quote, production is very much in the background, end quote. Therefore, quote, the struggles around production do not play the central role one might have expected in a historical account of capitalist development, end quote. And footnote. Where am I? In Holloway's opinion, the state must be understood as a, quote, moment of the development of the totality of social relations, unquote. As a, quote, part of the antagonistic and crisis-ridden development of capitalist society, end quote. And as a form of capitalist social relations aiming at the reproduction of capitalist society. And therefore it is, quote, not just a state in a capitalist society, but a capitalist state, end quote. In other words, a critical theory of the state must be derived from the, quote, historical materialist category of the capital relation, end quote, and the, quote, historical form of class domination, end quote. More importantly, understanding the state not just as a fixed and rigidified form, but also as a process of forming social relations, means not only that the, quote, state is constantly reconstituted as an instance separate from society, end quote, but also that, quote, the very existence of the state is a process of struggle, end quote. Holloway. Footnote. Holloway also laid particular stress on the relation between the state and everyday life and practice, and the struggles that are developing in and against the state. In Holloway's attempt to make sense of the state as a form of everyday capitalist class practice, Holloway makes a distinction between, quote, state form and, quote, state apparatus. On this, see Bonefelt's critique. According to Bonefelt, Holloway's argument, quote, is not at all clear on the separation of form and apparatus, end quote. Holloway reproduces in his analysis a dualism between the, quote, historically concrete development of the state apparatus, end quote, and the, quote, form of the state as a constant process of class struggle, end quote. End footnote. In his critical review of Clark's The State Debate, which is on this channel, and its contributors, Bonefelt epitomized the distinctiveness of the open Marxist contribution to the Conference of Socialist Economists' theoretical discussions on the state. Footnote. In the recomposition of the British state during the 1980s, in which Bonefelt, quote, sets out to conceptualize the development of the British state during the 1980s in class terms, and, quote, Bonefelt points out that, quote, my own approach relies heavily on the approach put forward by Clark. The discussion of Clark attempts in an affirmative but nonetheless critical way to clarify my own approach, end quote. In his critical review of Clark's The State Debate, Bonefelt adopted a similar stance. End footnote. Its characteristic approach was concerned with the, quote, primacy accorded to class struggle, the emphasis on the, quote, internal relation, end quote, between structure and struggle, and the understanding of the relationship between the economic and the political as standing to each other in a relation of difference and unity, end quote. On the other hand, Bonafelt saw the accounts developed by Barker, Hirsch, and Jessup as an endeavor to make sense of the state as a, quote, particular structure which is reproduced by social conflict, a social conflict which takes place within the framework of the objective laws of capitalist development, end quote. Bonafelt. According to Bonafelt, the German state derivation debate was criticized in the CSE theoretical elaborations for its neglect of the class struggle and the analysis of the form of the state. In his effort to grapple with the vexed issue of the class struggle approach to the state, Bonafelt addressed the issue of the internal relation between structure and struggle and argued that the debates within the CSE did not manage to overcome the dualist conception of the relation between structure and struggle. Quote, the focus on class struggle, end quote, Bonafelt opined, quote, can lead very easily to a conception of the working class as external to capital, end quote. The issue at stake here, according to Bonafelt, is that this externality between structure and the class struggle tends to understand class struggle as, quote, a relation between two opposing armies whose internal relationship remains unexplored, end quote. Bonafelt. This external relation and the emphasis placed on the class struggle result in the conceptualization of the state as a, quote, object of class struggle and not a mode of existence of labor and capitalism, end quote. Bonafelt concludes that Clark's overall position regarding the state and the primacy he ascribes to class struggle needs to be taken one step further in the direction of comprehending the state as a contradictory political form which is constituted by the antagonistic presence of labor in the concept of capital. Holloway, Bonafelt, and Clark also engaged in a critical debate with Hirsch and Jessup concerning the issue of the state in an attempt to develop and articulate a theoretical and political approach on the specific, quote, reformulation of state theory, end quote, and of the, quote, regulation approach, end quote. Open Marxists provided a critical understanding of the social constitution of the political form of the capitalist state society, thus emphasizing the primary role of the class struggle and the internal relation between structure and class struggle. They also stressed the role of the state in depoliticizing the relationship between capital and labor and its decisive contribution to the manner in which capitalist society organizes capitalist society's own reproduction. What was common in their critique of other Marxist accounts they criticized was that they, quote, disarticulate the internal relation between structure and class struggle, end quote. And in addition to that, they, quote, reduce the class struggle to a, quote, but also, end quote, position quite separated from the, quote, objective laws of capitalist development, end quote, Bonafelt and Holloway. The issue of the relation between structure and struggle was taken up by Bonafelt and Bonafelt's extensive analysis and contribution to the open Marxist critical theory of the state. In laying out his argument, Bonafelt argued that, quote, structure should be seen as a mode of existence of class antagonism, and, quote, of capital and labor, and therefore as, quote, resultant premise of class struggle, end quote. In a critical analysis of the state theory of Hirsch, Jessup, and structural Marxism, Bonafelt pointed out that despite the important differences in the approaches, they perpetuate the dualism of structure and struggle. Bonafelt held that this position was still formed under the influence of Poulantzas' structural thinking, in which the, quote, question of the, quote, inner nature, end quote, of the relation of capital and labor within diverse social and political phenomena was reduced merely to a question of the historical cohesion of different structures, end quote. Bonafelt. For Bonafelt, the political and economic constitution of contradictory unity, which subsists as a movement of contradiction, both the political and economic entailed different modes of existence and notion of fundamental antagonism of capital and labor, a mode of existence of the presence of labor within capital. The development of this contradiction is defined by the result of the class struggle. In this sense, the class character of the capitalist state must be understood as a historically specific form that is open to the class struggle between capital and labor. The demystification of political structures reveals them as forms, as modes of existence in and through class struggle subsist, as political forms of class antagonism. This emphasis on the constitutive power of labor and its mode of existence in capitalism helps Bonafelt to conceptualize the internal relation between structure and struggle, the contradictory character of both capital and state, and to outline the unique and distinctive contributions of open Marxism in relation to the structuralist and autonomist approaches. Footnote. On this, see Werner Bonafelt, 2003 article, Human Practice and Perversion, Beyond Autonomy and Structure, published in Revolutionary Writing, Common Sense Essays, and Post-Political Politics, published with Autonomedia. End footnote. And that's the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for listening. That was chapter 4 of Christos Memos' Open Marxism, Critical Theory as Militant Enlightenment, and chapter 4 was titled Dispelling the Statist Myth of Socialism on Party and State Forms.